Hey everybody, today I want to talk about this Canon 85mm lens. This is the L series f1.2 lens. Definitely a lens that portrait photographers like to idolize. And unlike some of my previous videos, I actually don't own this lens. And because of that, I didn't feel qualified to bring you a comprehensive high-level review of it where I talk about what it's good at, what it's not good at. Instead, I'm going to leave that to the others that probably already have done a better job than I can. And I just wanted to give you my impression about it. Being a non-professional portrait photographer, this lens was really interesting to me because I think it's a lot more than a portrait lens. It can be used in a lot of situations out there. And because it's such a high quality lens, I wanted to see what all it could do in different environments. So with the limited time I have it, because I don't own it, I just wanted to bring you what I thought. So first impression is that this lens is quite heavy. It weighs 2.3 pounds. It's about as much as a very large hedgehog. It's very heavy, very solid lens. You could probably drop it. Hopefully you never do. But it basically weighs as much as it costs. It's very sturdy, like I said. And then my next impression was a couple of things actually. So unlike some of the other lenses, Canon or any other lenses, any other brands, the rear glass element is actually flush on the mount, the EF mount, which means that when you are, unmounting the lens, changing your lenses, swapping them, you have to be really careful not to smudge that glass element. In fact, that happened to me when I handed the lens to someone while I was changing my lenses out and got it back with a fingerprint. Something to keep in mind. Another first thing is that this lens, even though it is quite large, it's not image stabilized. So really the large size of it is contributed by the large aperture, which is 1.2, which is almost the same diameter as the focal length of the lens, which is very impressive. So with that in mind, I wanted to mention one more thing. The focus ring on this lens. I'm assuming that most portrait photographers, when using this lens, they rely on their autofocus. And it has great autofocus. However, if you've used this lens, or if you will use this lens, you're going to notice that the autofocus, that the speed of the motors themselves are pretty sluggish. It feels like you're moving gears. You're moving like 10,000 pounds of glass, and it kind of is what it's doing. So that's something to keep in mind. And when I actually had to use this lens in manual focus, which happened more than I wanted it to happen, I found it was a little awkward because the physical focus ring itself doesn't have any hard stops, so it kind of spins around, which is the case with a lot of Canon lenses, but it just feels more physically unattached to the actual focusing mechanism. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel that maybe some other people would agree with me here. But again, with a good autofocusing system, you really don't need a manual focus unless you're trying to do some kind of a manual video footage where you're trying to back to focus. I'm not sure. But that's something I noticed, and that's my first impression. And so when I began using this lens on, in this case, a Canon 6D, as you'll see here a bit later on, the first thing I noticed was, of course, just probably like any other amateur photographer, I wanted to take a photo at f1.2 because that's the most narrow depth of field, get the coolest effect, right? Well, I noticed that it was missing the focus. Trying to focus on someone's eyes, I'm getting their nose. Actually, I was getting behind their eyes. So immediately I thought, okay, well, I just need to calibrate the lens. Went inside my camera body, calibrated the autofocus, which most Canon DSLRs are capable of doing that. And you know what? I ended up having to calibrate this lens about a dozen times. I felt like I wanted the focusing to be closer to me. Not sure if that is a common thing. If you're shooting at f1, 5.6, where your depth of field is a little deeper, then things like that are not as noticeable. But if you're trying to get that low light shot right in the right focusing point, it's very important that the autofocusing works right. And I'm going to admit that the 6D isn't the best camera for autofocusing, for quick autofocusing. But still, I was surprised that I had to calibrate it so many times. And you know what? It could easily just be a user error. I'm going to admit, like I said, I haven't had this for a long time. And someone who's more seasoned with this 85mm lens would probably kill my argument in a second. So with that in mind, let's just go ahead and take a look at some of the footage I got, some of the photos I got, and I'll kind of explain what's going on. So one of the first things I wanted to do was I wanted to take this lens out and take some photography, handheld, street style photography where you're not prepared, you're not planned, you're just kind of going out there and taking photos and seeing how well your equipment works with your, random ideas. In this case, please remember that, neither the lens or the camera body have image stabilization. So you're really relying on the shutter speed and your ability to take a sharp photo, which obviously means that the lens needs to be able to take photos with plenty of light coming in, which again is something that this lens is known for because it has a really wide, capable aperture. Let's talk about one thing real quick, is the chromatic aberration. It's not a big deal with this lens. It's an expensive lens. However, with completely wide open aperture, it's virtually impossible to completely eliminate such things. And I'll show you here real quick. I'm going to zoom in on this photo. This is a raw image taken at f1.2. This is during the sunset, so lighting was not ideal. But however, as you can see, with aperture priority, the ISO is 100, and the shutter speed is plenty to take a pretty sharp photo. All the way zoomed in, you immediately notice that the violet and the green chromatic aberration. But to compare, let's go to f5.6 with the same exact shot. Zoom in all the way, immediately a very clean image. The sharpness is incredible. I'm going to go back to that 1.2 and it's a lot softer. Back to the 5.6, very sharp image and virtually no chromatic aberration. Now, if you are a photographer that loves to have lens flare in their photos, when you take portraits or whatever with the sunsets, you might be slightly disappointed with this lens. And there's a reason for this, guys. Lens flare is, in a way, a defect of a lens, where the glass does not correctly transmit the light and you get flare all over the place. Just like if you're wearing bad glasses, you're going to have glare, you're going to have flare, and all sorts of issues. If you're looking for that with this lens, you're probably not going to get that. Here's a photo taken directly against the window, which during the sunset there was a bunch of light coming in here. As you can see, there's really not a whole lot of lens flare going on at all. In fact, it's a very clean image. Typically I shoot a lot with vintage lenses, and with one of my old Fujinon lenses or Yashica lenses, I would have gotten a bunch of light rays right here. It would have blocked it with that sort of lens flare effect, and you would have lost a lot of detail and information on the actual subject. Here's another image taken against the sun. Again, there's a little bit of lens flare here, but nothing compared to some of those older lenses. And that's actually one reason why a lot of people like older vintage lenses, especially with cinematographers and such, because they have those defects, those natural defects that don't really exist anymore today because of technology, and people like that. But again, you might have to be relying on some post-processing if you're trying to get that cool lens flare or whatever. This lens has an aperture with 8 blades in it, so it creates a relatively round bokeh. However, if you do start closing in on the aperture, let's go to f2.0 here, I'll zoom in over here, you'll actually see that the bokeh has sort of this octagon stop sign shape to it because there are 8 aperture blades. And no matter what, you still kind of notice it, but it's still a very beautiful effect. And I'm going to jump all the way to f5.6 here. The image is very sharp, but there's still this beautiful out of focus going on here. And finally, here's another image. This was taken at f1.2, completely wide open. The lighting was, minimal here. There was just those lights behind and a bit of lighting from a separate room coming in. And the image was still good. I want to talk more about the focusing ability of this lens at 1.2, but I don't want to waste too much time. Long story short is that you just have to be very careful and very, practiced when trying to hit the correct focus. In this case, I was trying to focus on the eyes, and it was more or less successful, but it took a lot of attempts because at 1.2, your depth of field is very narrow, and you're depending on the autofocusing capabilities of your camera, you may or may not get the results you're looking for. So in my case, I ended up shooting in manual sometimes, manual focus, and sometimes just shooting a lot of photos with autofocus and getting the one that worked out. But the bokeh is absolutely crazy. You get these little onion shapes. There is that chromatic aberration ring happening around the out of focus subject. But again, we talked about that earlier. When it's wide open, you almost have no way of avoiding it unless you're, in camera correction or post correction is able to fix that. So finally, I had some time in the evening and with my wife just wanted to take random photos of her playing the piano. I had some lighting set up, nothing professional, but just, you know, just trying to experiment with the lens. I wanted also to see how, you know, how intense the depth of field could get if that's what you're trying to compose with. Here is a photo of her playing the piano, the photo of the hands and the keys at 1.2. Again, incredibly narrow depth of field, absolutely beautiful. If that's what you're trying to compose with and you want that depth of field image, I mean, the lens is absolutely magnificent. Here we have f1.8. You get a little more depth of field, you get kind of a better idea of what's going on here, but still very beautiful. It kind of washes out the background and the foreground. And then we have 2.5, you start getting more detail, you start realizing that there's actually a logo here, the company name of the piano, that wasn't even noticeable before. And 3.5, start getting a lot more, you start seeing more detail on the left hand. f8.0, you get a lot more detail. However, of course, a lot less light is coming in and my ISO was at 12,800 here. But still, very interesting effect. You can be really creative with this lens depending on what you're looking for, what kind of result you want to get. It's just incredibly fun to experiment with it. You know, I'm tempted to say, oh, is it worth to buy this lens or not? That's not the point of this video. The point here is to actually, I want to say this. If I had to explain this whole thing in one sentence, I would say that this 85mm lens forced me out of my comfort zone. There are many reasons to that. It's a prime lens that's fixed to 85mm, which is a really interesting focal length for a lot of different things. And it really forces you to be creative. You know, a lot of times with the capability of Lightroom and other editing softwares, we think, you know, here's what I want. I'm gonna take a picture and then I'm gonna get what I want on the computer. And I feel like with this lens, it's less forgiving. You really wanna do it the right way, in the camera, in the spot, right at the moment. Think about your shot, do your best. Because if you do, you're gonna get an awesome result.